introduce our fourth and final session in this symposium entitled Urban Design and Planning. This session is going to examine the role of urban design practices and concepts before, during, and after epidemics, and the factors that shaped and codified each, from the benign to bureaucratic to even the more nefarious, and the longer-term implications for urban design, urban life, climatic zoning, and natural environments.
Our first speaker in this session is Carlo Trombino, who is a PhD student at the University of Palermo, Department of Culture and Society. He holds an MA in History at the University of Bologna. He's currently working on a multimedia research project on the 16th to 17th centuries Mediterranean slave trade with a focus on Mercedarian order and other redeeming institutions in Sicily and Catalonia.
Good morning, everyone. My presentation concerns the urban design developed by Giovanni Filippo Ingrassia during the 1576 plague in the city of Palermo. The measures adopted by Giovanni Filippo Ingrassia helped tackle the disease by using a rational, scientific method in managing patients and the whole population. Ingrassia was one of the most famous scientists of his era. He had already written several books and was a pioneer in social epidemiology. He was appointed to guide the scientific task force working for the government to contain the epidemic by creating a network of public hospitals and a strict protocol discussed with the physicians working on the field. The measures adopted in order to contrast the plague in the city of Palermo are carefully described in the book you will see in the next slide. Here you can see the cover of the original 1576 version of the Informazione del pestifero e contagioso morbo, written during that same year by Ingrassia. This book became one of the most important analyses of the disease in that period, and for this reason it was translated into German and Latin and had a wide diffusion all throughout Europe, setting a benchmark for future emergency responses to epidemic outbreaks. It offers us the complete report of his intervention, with a detailed description of his epidemic urban planning. The cover, as you can see, presents the main aspects involved during the emergency. The gold in the left rectangle, which symbolizes the economic measures taken during the emergency in the city. Then, on the right, the fire reminds of the hygiene protocol adopted in order to contain the spread of the disease. At the bottom, gallows and ropes are depicted to remind everybody of the strict and unkind laws applied to all of those who didn't abide to them. In the center of the cover, the allegory of justice. Ingrassia's thought was influenced by philosophers such as Marsilio Ficino and Aristotle, but he also discussed his proposals with experts in different disciplines and, of course, the political and religious powers. Urbanistic changes were one of the main interventions he did in order to contrast the spread of the deadly disease. Slide. As you can see from this map of the city of Palermo, the old walled city pictured at the bottom is where the virus spread. Ingrassia decided to put it on lockdown and nobody could enter by land or by sea. From an urbanistic and organizational point of view, Ingrassia intervened by creating hospitals and forcing monasteries to host quarantined patients. Then, specific areas were arranged in order to manage plague-related processes, such as washing the laundry, burning the infected goods, or giving a shelter to those who needed. He soon realized that he could not stop the contagion if the infected were inside of the walled city. That's why he intervened in the immediate surroundings, with epidemic urban planning that boosted the creation of new boroughs and reshaped the urban space. These places are pictured in the book, as we can see with more detail from the extracts in the following slide. The drawing on the right depicts a well-known building in the city of Palermo, which is called La Cuba. This building pre-existed the coming of the plague and dates back to the Arab-Norman period. Ingrassia decided that this place would have hosted plague patients. The buildings surrounding the main one are also instrumental to this proposal. There is the houses of physicians on the left and on the bottom. And at the base of the palace, we can see some buildings which were the male and female patients' halls, while outside on the right, there were the recovering women building. Between them, strategically placed in a well-connected while isolated part of the city, we can see gallows and instruments of torture, creating a vivid example of epidemic urban planning. The second image on the left shows Borgo Santa Lucia, and this was another urban planning intervention, as Ingrassia ordered the draining of the swamps, pictured at the bottom, to make the place healthier, and also he gave a boost to the renovation of the households that you can see on the bottom left, in order to isolate the suspects, which means the relatives of those who died. Those works implemented the urbanization of that hamlet by creating new water sources and using those available in a new, more effective way. This epidemic urbanization soon became the natural extension of the city to its northern route, a process that continued in the centuries following that period until very recent times. Ingrassia convinced the Duke of Bivona to host in his garden, pictured at the center of the left image, to host the cleaning, sanitization, or burning of infected goods. And this whole urban intervention was intended to fight the disease. The newly built and renovated houses were intended for the social distancing of the suspects who, unlike the rich, could not afford to safely quarantine at home. This explains the deep understanding he had of the social environment he lived in, as he intervened to solve the structural problems people could have faced when trying to isolate inside their own houses. His interest for the well-being of the more disadvantaged sectors of society led Ingrassia to another epidemic urbanistic intervention, inside the wall this time, as we can see in the next slide. If somebody visits Palermo today, he won't notice rivers crossing the city, but we know that the city was rich in water causes, which made it a lush and blooming capital. One of the rivers which crossed and still crosses underground Palermo is the Papireto River. This map shows us the intervention of burial of the river and reclamation of the swamps, which was intended to prevent the spread of other infections and diseases in the future, in one of the poorest parts of town, reshaping urban space and creating a continuum between the Capo neighborhood and the southern suburbs. In the next slide, we can see a visual representation of the victory over the plague, when city went back to normality. The disease was beaten and religious and social life restarted as it was before the outbreak. There wasn't what today we call new normal, because new normal is just the perpetuation of the emergency. Ingrassia instead had an emergential approach, but he also saw the emergency as an opportunity to improve the health system. And urban design was indeed part of a new integrated public health system. Ingrassia was able to tackle the disease by reshaping the urban space in order to give the population a healthy living space, and especially to the more disadvantaged people, like women often referred to in this book, and the lower economic classes, by sanitizing swamps and the burial of the Papireto River, the creation of several hospitals, and the boosting in housing projects outside of the walls. Epidemic urban design was intended very differently than today. Ingrassia urban design was not intended to stop normality to create a new normal. It was aimed at improving the living condition to continue life as it was before, and urban space was crucial to that. While creating a new, healthier urban space, Ingrassia also advocated for the hanging and public torturing of thieves and of those who intentionally spread the disease, as we saw in the first cover picture. He purposefully created an urban landscape of tortured bodies to scare the population into respecting the norms. But this was only a response to an epidemic emergency, and it enabled him to create a procedure that eventually helped the city recover from another plague epidemic 50 years later in 1624. Today, it seems that, however useful emergency measures, want to be used by governments to create a new normality where emergency is the norm, but instead it is possible to rethink the human and urban space to create better living conditions for the whole population. And I think that in this sense we can learn from Inglaterra. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlo. Our next speaker is Andrew Wells, who is a cultural historian of the early modern Atlantic world. He obtained his doctorate in modern history at the University of Oxford. He's the author of a dozen articles and book chapters dealing with topics ranging from the cultural history of the Titanic disaster to the history of racism in the pre-modern world.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Mohammed and Caitlin for organising such a great colloquium. This paper is about just how much we have in common with 17th century city dwellers in our shared fight against epidemic disease. It also emphasises the fact that our forebears had certain tools available to combat some of the social and cultural side effects of pandemics that we badly need. This need appears even more stark given the large common ground we share. Next slide, please. An important first step in establishing the historical context of my case study is to strip away the layers of myth that have surrounded the plague since its disappearance from England in the mid-1660s. Such myths began to accrue, if not during the Great Plague of 1665-6, then soon after. And this drawing by the artist Alfred Montague, which depicts the burial of the dead near St James Priory Church in Bristol, shows the Victorian romanticisation of the Great Plague in full swing. In reality, this outbreak of bubonic plague, which was so devastating in London, actually hit Bristol fairly lightly in comparison with epidemics in earlier decades. Archaeological evidence shows that there were neither mass, hurried, nor undecorous burials at St James's during the epidemic. And of course, romanticising the last major outbreak of epidemic plague could only occur once it was firmly established that 1665-6 was the last outbreak, something about which Britons could not be confident until well into the 18th century. Next slide. So the focus of this paper is on the city of Bristol in southwest England. It was an important port, not yet the second city of England that it was to become after 1700, but still key, as testified by the efforts of royalists and parliamentarians to gain control of the city during the Civil War. It had changed hands twice during that conflict, succumbing to a royalist siege in 1643 and then returning to parliamentary control in 1645, and both sieges coincided with outbreaks of epidemic disease, first of typhus and then of plague. Both of these hit harder than the outbreak of the mid-1660s. By that date, the city was recovering economically and politically from the dislocations of civil war and revolution. In common with many English cities, it was run by an urban oligarchy, but had a comparatively large electorate with an open franchise for all freemen and boasted a total population of roughly 15,000. The contemporary map shown on the right indicates how Bristol was centred on the space between two rivers, the Avon and the Frome, and you can see these from the ships and other vessels depicted. This central zone, which takes up vertically the middle third of the map, contained the most ancient parishes in which lived the wealthiest citizens, and their poorer fellow Bristolians lived to the south and the east, where there was much open space by the roads to London and Gloucester. Next slide, please. This slide shows the social geography of the city more closely, and we can see that reported cases of the plague occurred in the poorer parts of the city during the 1665-6 outbreak. The large area bordered in red was St Philips's parish, which came to be so infected because it was on the London Road and because of certain measures introduced by the city to combat the disease. As today, there was real fear that continued economic activity would promote the spread of illness. So one of the first measures undertaken by Bristol's Common Council was to spend a considerable amount of money to persuade the King's Privy Council to issue a proclamation banning the holding of St James's Fair in the city. They spent about £24, or about $3,100 in today's money. Now, this had been done in the past during outbreaks of plague, but was controversial. In 1637, a group of London traders successfully petitioned the Privy Council to be allowed to travel to Bristol, which was granted as long as they bore certificates of health from the Lord Mayor of London. Further measures were passed in June 1665 to force householders in the city to keep watch and guard the city's gates, only allowing in Londoners with these certificates of health. Their goods, however, had to be left outside the city for a period of 30 days so they could be aired, in accordance with widely held notions that miasma produced infectious disease. These goods were all held just outside Lawford's Gate in St Philip's parish. Understandably, the owners of these goods would want to be housed near their merchandise, so this part of the city would have hosted a large proportion of Londoners entering the city. Next slide, please. Additional measures with implications for urban design and planning were taken as the plague threatened Bristol in late 1665 and into 1666. The Privy Council gave an order banning St Paul's Fair, and pest houses were constructed or rented. On this slide, you can see 3 sites used in the 17th century for the relocation of plague victims. On the left is the Little Park, part of today's Tyndall's Park, where a number of huts were built for the infected during the plague of 1651. The 2 sites to the right, the Wistry and the building actually labelled the pest house, were both sites used to house plague victims in 1665-6. Extensive construction work also took place at the latter site, and the city's bakers and doctors kept the sick supplied with bread and medicines. The pest house still existed as late as the 1790s, by which time the association of disease with the northeast of Bristol and its adjoining hinterland had become cemented, due to the establishment of smallpox inoculation houses there in the 1760s and 1770s. Next slide, please. The relief efforts of the 1660s all cost money, and the massive reduction in economic activity, coupled with the increase in taxation to pay for relief efforts, provoked resistance. Individuals tried to break into the city through the cordon sanitaire and were hauled in front of the city's magistrates. On the Gloucestershire side of Lawford's Gate, where the urban authorities had no jurisdiction, Londoners congregated with their goods in the hope that the St Paul's Fair would still take place. They had to be dispersed. Above all, people were slow to pay their share of the taxes imposed to meet these costs. In early 1666, the city authorities forbade wealthy Bristolians from leaving the city because of the plague, without first paying a sum as security against further levies. But the doctor, baker and carpenter who served the pest houses were still waiting in 1667 to receive payment for their efforts. There were even attempts to take financial advantage of Bristol's plight. The nearby city of Bath spread the false rumour that plague was still raging at Bristol in mid-1666 in the hope of having its St James's Fair relocated there. Yet what did not occur, and what I want to highlight in closing, was the blatant exploitation of the epidemic as individuals attempted to profiteer by hoarding supplies that were needed and selling them at a profit. We've all seen such stories of people, and indeed governments, hoarding hand sanitizer, toilet rolls, and even personal protective equipment during the COVID-19 crisis. But such activities were far rarer in the case of Bristol's 17th century plague. The reasons for this are simple, and hence do not appear in the documentary record of the plague itself. As everywhere else in early modern England, Bristol had very strong regulations and penalties against the common law offences of regrating, forestalling, and engrossing. Regrating was the practice of buying goods and reselling them in or near the very same place to artificially inflate their price. Forestalling involved buying goods before they came to market, preventing sellers from coming to market or persuading traders to hike up the price. And engrossers bought up large quantities of a product to monopolise supply. Present-day profiteers are arguably guilty of all 3 of these offences and would have enjoyed no sympathy from early modern people in the best of times, let alone during an epidemic. We too have a moral repugnance for such acts, particularly in a time of crisis, and yet such behaviour is perceived to be, if not an acceptable part of neoliberal capitalism, then a regrettable but unavoidable side effect. By ditching what historians have termed a moral economy, characteristic of early modern economic life, we've made ourselves vulnerable to unscrupulous individuals. The common ground we share with Bristolians of 1665-6 in our efforts to conquer epidemic disease only makes this attempted exploitation more naked and unmistakable. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Our next speaker is Irina Davidovich, who is a senior researcher, and she leads the GTA Institute doctoral program at ETH Zurich. She obtained her master's in philosophy and doctorate in the history and philosophy of architecture at the University of Cambridge. She's the author of Forms of Practice, German-Swiss Architecture between 1980 and 2000. And the editor of Alan Colquhoun, From Bricolage to Myth.
Thank you, Mohammed, for the introduction. Hello, everybody. The COVID crisis highlights parallels with how public health has historically shaped our cities. The cholera outbreaks in 19th century London focused attention on the city's insalubrious quarters as main centers and spreaders of disease. The fear of indiscriminate contagion triggered the reform momentum to clear and rebuild the slums and the assumption of government responsibility for the built environment. My focus today is on its effects on housing. Next slide, please. Until the mid-19th century, it was widely believed that cholera was caused by miasma, a poisonous vapor caused by organic rot. The 19th century outbreaks that killed thousands of Londoners in 1832 and 1854 were associated with a succession of 4 cholera pandemics that changed the health landscape worldwide. In London, the so-called King Cholera was associated with the overcrowded, polluted environment of the city's poor. Opposing medical opinion at the time, the physician John Snow rejected that cholera was transmitted via foul air in his 1849 essay on the mode of communication of cholera. He gathered new evidence during the 1854 outbreaks, when he correlated a cluster of cholera deaths to the Broad Street public water pump in St. Giles Rookery, current day Soho. The revised essay of 1855 included a map of Snow's findings, connecting the concentration of deaths to the water supply. Upon examination, this pump was found to have been infiltrated from the cesspit of a neighboring house. Snow's map did more than identify the source of infection, it firmly embedded the spread of the disease in London's dense built fabric. Next, please. Rookeries were dense slums in which dire poverty was associated with an abandonment of social norms. Reverend Thomas Beames described St. Giles Rookery as, and I quote, worst sink of iniquity, built like a honeycomb, perforated by a number of courts and blind alleys without any outlet other than the entrance, end of quote. Friedrich Engel's harrowing description of the same quarters focused on the squalor of St. Giles, and I quote, filth and tottering ruins surpass all description, heaps of garbage and ashes lie in all directions, and the foul liquids emptied before the doors gather in stinking pools. Typically for his time, Engels associated physical decrepitude with a sense of moral decay, and I quote again, those who have not yet sunk in the whirlpool of moral ruin which surrounds them are sinking daily deeper, losing more and more of their power to resist the demoralizing influence of want, filth, and evil surroundings. The Victorian association between poverty, contagion, and immorality was localized in Charles Booth's maps of London, in which the black slums were a shorthand for what he called vicious semi-criminal classes. The Booth maps articulated what Robin Evans called a moral geography of London, in which slums doubled up as infectious foci for cholera and criminality alike. The maps reveal the distribution of wealth, shown in gold, in the West, determined among other considerations by the direction of predominant winds. Thus, concentration of capital, clean air, and moral respectability were the prerogative of the rich West, while pollution and disease congregated in working class areas and the industrial East. And thus, it might have well stayed, were it not for the cholera outbreaks that shifted public opinion and triggered political action, notably in the form of Public Health Acts in 1848 and 1875. Next, please. The Peabody Trust, which was set up by US businessman George Peabody, was London's largest working class housing provider in the 19th century. The Peabody estate in Islington was the first and the prototype for 18 others designed by in-house architect Henry Astley Derbyshire. The large sites, reclaimed through slum clearance, allowed the imposition of an ideal geometric form derived from the urban typology of the square. The Peabody estate stood out from the labyrinthine fabric of slums and dense speculative terraces through a rationalized layout of standardized blocks. Unlike the prosperous 18th century London squares, the Peabody ones were open at the corners, allowing the natural ventilation of the quadrangle. This characteristic layout was equivalent to a social distancing of architectural volumes. Essentially, the estate worked as a gated community surrounded by railings locked up at night. Its physical isolation was doubled up by a sense of moral distancing. Peabody residents had to prove a regular income and adhere to strict norms of behavior and hygiene under the control of superintendents. The continuous row of shorter blocks that can be seen to the south of the square, on the left, was added in the early 1870s as increased demand led to the site's densification. Here, Derbyshire supplanted with this compact typology the earlier longer model, which had been organized as a corridor plan. Next, please. The modified version of the Peabody standard block, first used at Blackfriars Estate and applied thereafter, was adapted from Henry Roberts' model houses of 20 years before. As Evans wrote, Roberts' housing prototype was based on a new vision of quote-unquote introverted domesticity. The interactions of compartmentalized nuclear families were minimized through the reduction of common circulations. Thus, the semi-external staircases explicitly served the hygienic purpose, natural ventilation, and efficient quarantine conditions, as well as an implicit moral one, the creation of a public neutral buffer zone between dwellings, reducing the potential of dubious encounters. The private lavatories were a bold departure from the usual common cesspit, which had proven an important source of disease. As you can see from the plans, the Peabody trustees opted instead for so-called associated dwellings with external latrines that could be regularly inspected and cleaned. In the Islington plan, these were situated at the extremities away from the naturally ventilated stairs in the middle. The residents complained about the long dark corridors, though they were more concerned with drafts and cold than with awkward social encounters. In the compact blocks, first used at Blackfriars, 5 dwellings on each floor opened to a central naturally ventilated core where both the stairs and communal bathrooms were located. These compact plans also proved more efficient at an urban scale, allowing the blocks more flexible distribution in nooks and crannies of less regular sites. Next, please. I conclude with the boundary street estate, the first and exemplary incursion of the London County Council into housing, which represent what the historian John Nelson Tan called the maturing of municipal responsibility. A progressive urban model, this landmark estate replaced the infamous Yago slum that you can see with a radial layout signaling a new dignified urban and social order. Designed in the ideological framework of a late Victorian socialism, the estate embodied a new deference for the laboring classes and their craft. Having claimed thousands of lives across the social spectrum, Victorian London's cholera crisis created a political momentum for far-reaching urban reform. Over some 50 years, it led to the adoption of building norms, metropolitan programs of slum clearance, and new types of working class housing. Epidemiological findings from the cholera outbreaks led not only to the update of London's sewage system, but also to the integration of air circulation strategies in urban housing. Thus, the most widespread and conventional configurations of modern housing today even originate in a defensive impulse to curb the spread of disease. Currently, cities are responding to the parallel crisis of health and climate change with plans to implement cycle lane system, traffic-free areas, and self-sufficient neighborhoods with shops and walk within walkable distance. While it is too early to speculate how COVID will affect housing, it indicates a renewed push towards urban decentralization, lower residential densities, and compartmentalized living units. A relapse is indicated in the origin of the word apartment, apartare, to separate. Minimal or external common circulations or private external areas such as balconies could become compulsory in future. More than anything, however, these examples invite parallels between the laissez-faire attitude of Victorian capitalism and current neoliberalism, which has today concealed simmering social crises behind the facade of, by now, skeletal welfare provisions. How will we balance the accumulation of real estate versus the need for personal distancing? How will urban agglomerations be managed? The COVID crisis has laid bare the reciprocity of compassionate top-down governance and collective bottom-up responsibility. Like cholera before it, it has laid bare the hidden causalities of anything goes development, social inequality, and environmental distress. It holds politicians and citizens personally accountable and demands a new maturing of responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Irina. Our next speaker is Suzanne Burns, who is a historian of Japan, who has published widely on the social history of medicine and public health in modern Japan. Her most recent monograph, Kingdom of the Sick, A History of Leprosy and Japan, was published in 2019 by the University of Hawaii Press. She is currently completing a book tentatively entitled Cartographies of Care, Medicine and Public Health in 19th Century Tokyo.
Thank you, Mohammed. Over the course of the 19th century, Japan was struck by a series of devastating cholera epidemics. The human and social crisis that resulted occurred during a moment of political turmoil. In 1868, a political revolution led to the overthrow of the Tokugawa shogunate and the establishment of a new government. In this brief presentation, I want to explore the public health response to cholera by looking specifically at Tokyo, the largest and most populous city in Japan. My focus is on the establishment of quarantine hospitals, the most visible, controversial, and contested aspect of the government's response to cholera. Cholera first reached Edo, as Tokyo was known until 1868, in August 1858. It ravaged the city for almost 3 months. Slide, please. Contemporary estimates put the total death toll at between 50,000 and 100,000 people, or 5 to 10% of the city's population. The term cholera was initially written with Chinese characters for tiger and badger, reflecting the belief of some that the disease resulted from a malevolent animal spirit. And here you see that representation in a patent medicine ad from the 1880s. Next slide, please. As the death toll rose, crematoria and burial sites were quickly overwhelmed, and the frightened populace sought relief through communal rituals of expiation and appeasement. Meanwhile, the samurai officials who administered the city did little but distribute leaflets offering dietary and other advice. After 1868, the control of cholera became a testing ground for the new government's public health policies. Tokyo was the epicenter of several epidemics. In 1882, 13% of all cases were in Tokyo. In 1886, 7%, and in 1890, 5%. The city proved a fertile ground for cholera for several reasons. Slide, please. Although population had declined by about a third by 1868, it rebounded rapidly in the 1870s. Because the new central government retained control of much land in the old warrior districts in the western part of the city, new migrants had no option but to settle in the densely populated eastern wards. Old and new slums, which appear in purple on my map, old and new slums peppered the city. In these areas, the poor lived in one-room apartments with shared toilets and a common well, outside and often in close proximity to each other. Next slide, please. These wells were a problem. Much of the city was supplied by water from rivers west and north of the city, using a system of canals and bamboo piping that dated back to the 17th century. While the water at its source was of good quality, it was heavily contaminated as it moved through the city. In addition, the wards east of the Sumida River, relied on shallow wells that tapped into easily contaminated surface water. So if you think back to the previous map, you can see that areas of dense population and areas of poor water quality, in fact, overlapped. The first test of the government's ability to control cholera came in early September 1877. After learning of an outbreak in Hong Kong, the Japanese government issued aggressive policies in preparation for what it viewed as the inevitable spread of cholera to Japan. These regulations included allowing local officials to suspend all public gathering, restrictions on the sale of fresh vegetables and fish in markets, a requirement that bodies of the dead be cremated or buried quickly without ceremony, rules for the disinfection of public toilets and wells, and regulations for the disposal of human waste. But the linchpin of the government's plan to control cholera was the creation of a two-tier system of quarantine. Doctors were required to notify local public health officials in the case of a diagnosis, and these officials then had the authority to decide whether a patient could be quarantined at home or should be removed to a quarantine hospital. The rules for at-home quarantine were elaborate. The patient needed to be isolated from the rest of the household in a private room with access to separate toilet facilities. Obviously, this was a high bar that proved difficult for most of Tokyo's working class and poor to meet. Next slide, please. Cholera was first reported in Tokyo in mid-September, by which time 6 quarantine hospitals were in place around the city, and the hospitals are marked by the Red Cross. In the end, however, there were only 693 cases of the disease, so the number of people who actually experienced a quarantine hospital was very limited. Nonetheless, quarantine hospitals quickly became the object of growing popular outrage. There were reports of family members breaking into hospitals to seize their ailing relative, and of patients attempting to flee from windows. Those who lived in the vicinity of the hospitals flooded city authorities with complaints, arguing that the institutions threatened their health and economic well-being. In one frightening aspect of violence, a quarantine hospital was firebombed, apparently by a disgruntled neighbor. Why the hostile reaction to these institutions, designed, after all, to safeguard the city's residents? In this period, the hospital itself was a new institution, and the sick were usually cared for at home by family members. It was rumored that those confined in the quarantine hospitals were neglected and left to die, leading some to call them death hospitals, shibyoin, a play on the word for quarantine hospitals, hibyoin. But the location of the hospitals also contribute to resistance to quarantine. Land rights in Tokyo at this time were very complex, and the authorities had no legal right to expropriate land. As a result, quarantine hospitals were established on sites under the control of city officials, and these included prison grounds and the grounds of police hospitals, where forensic autopsies were carried out and suspected criminals were cared for. Next slide. So this is just a detail of a map showing the site of the Tokyo prison, which was where one of the earliest and largest quarantine hospitals was established. So quarantine hospitals came to carry the taint of criminality, stoking outrage that the sick were being treated as criminals rather than as innocent victims of a disease. Quarantine hospitals were by design temporary facilities, and with the end of an epidemic, they were burned to the ground. This meant that with each subsequent epidemic, Tokyo authorities were able to experiment with the siting of quarantine hospitals. Next slide, please. In 1879, when cholera returned to Tokyo, quarantine hospitals were established again, but this time on the perimeter of the city. Well, this lessened the number of complaints from city residents living in close proximity to the hospitals. The transport of patients from the densely populated center part of the city to the hospitals proved difficult in this era before public transportation, and the sight of the sick being carried through the city streets provoked panic and anxiety. Beginning with the 1882 epidemic, the government ordered that rates of infection and disease should be tracked at the level of the ward, making it possible for the first time to visualize which parts of the city were most heavily infected and the relationship between these hotspots and the quarantine hospitals. Next slide, please. As tracking rates of disease by ward began, quarantine hospitals were established in areas where there are high rates of infection. And you can see on both of my maps the correlation between prevalence and the siting of the hospitals. But this decision required officials again to make use of the grounds of police hospitals in the densely populated parts of the city, reigniting the tensions of the 1877 epidemic. To avoid removal to a quarantine hospital, some residents of Tokyo simply refrained from seeking medical care by a doctor, and that meant that they were free from the surveillance of the public health authorities. This led Tokyo officials to castigate the poor residents of the city, with one proclaiming that their selfish refusal to submit to quarantine threatened the very survival of the nation. Such rhetoric aside, public health officials gradually abandoned the idea of establishing autonomous temporary quarantine facilities. In 1889, as another cholera epidemic began, next slide please, the Tokyo government created a system of public hospitals that contained quarantine wards. The rules for quarantine did not change, but the separation of quarantine facilities from sites associated with the police and the penal system gradually helped change the perception of quarantine into a benign practice. What then are the implications of this study of cholera in Tokyo for the COVID-19 pandemic? For one, it reveals how both epidemic disease itself and public health responses to it make visible the social, economic, and material inequities that often shape urban life. Poor and working class residents in Tokyo were disproportionately vulnerable to cholera because of circumstances beyond their control, but they were also disproportionately affected by the quarantine policy. I'm reminded of my own city of Chicago, where the African American community on the South Side, where I live, has borne the brunt of the current pandemic. Secondly, the case of Tokyo compels us to think about which areas within a city are available to be appropriated and utilized in times of epidemic disease, and the significance and consequences of the use of these spaces. In New York City, Hart Island has been used to bury the unclaimed bodies of COVID-19 victims. The island has a long history of housing discriminated others. It has been a site of a poorhouse, a prison, and an insane asylum, and now it's under the control of the New York Department of Corrections. The use of this kind of marked space in contemporary New York, as in 1870s Tokyo, compels us, I think, to think carefully about the associations of specific urban sites and how their use, intentionally or not, can stigmatize the sick and the dead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suzanne. Our next speaker is Nicole Lalouvière, who is a doctoral fellow at the Institute of Landscape and Urban Studies, Department of Architecture, ETH Zurich. Through her doctoral research, she intends to produce a landscape and material history of the irrigation commons of Canton Valley in Switzerland.
Thank you, Mohammed. Hello to everyone attending this online symposium. I'm delighted to be here. I'm originally from Mauritius, and I'm going to be offering you some insights into its history today. Next slide, please. As we face many more months, possibly years, of fighting COVID-19, I suggest we turn to the case of Mauritius. Malaria devastated the island's population for over 100 years, yet the island was eventually successful in vanquishing the disease. Mauritius, I believe, offers a uniquely informative history of how landscape transformation and territorial zoning, along with the representational techniques of surveying and mapping, were key to these eradication efforts. In this short presentation, I'm going to describe environmental control of the disease through larviciding and the steps that led to the elimination campaign of 1948 to 1951, during which widespread spraying of insecticides was undertaken based on climatic zoning of the island's territory. Let us situate ourselves on this map, showing the island of Mauritius, which has an area of 1,800 square kilometers. It's 61 kilometers from north to south and 47 kilometers from east to west. It's situated in the Indian Ocean, 800 kilometers east of Madagascar. I'd like to call your attention to the volcanic topography of the island, which results in a high central plateau and lower coastal plains. The climate is subtropical, with heavy rainfall in the center and a much drier and warmer climate on the coasts. Mauritius has no native inhabitants and was consecutively colonized by the Dutch, the French, and the British. Malaria was probably brought to the island on slave ships from southern Africa. In 1865, the initial malaria outbreak killed 12% of the island's population. Next slide, please. In 1897, the British medical doctor and Nobel Prize winner, Dr. Ronald Ross, discovered the cause of malaria. He found that it was transmitted by the Anopheles mosquito. We now know that the mosquito acts as a vector for a Plasmodium parasite, which, unlike bacteria and viruses, cannot survive outside a living host. In 1907, Dr. Ross visited Mauritius to lead an entomological survey. His main recommendation was to establish environmental control over the disease, primarily through the drainage of marshes and bush clearing to destroy mosquito breeding places. Next slide, please. One such breeding site was Clairfond, where Ross and his team of moustiquiers tracked the behavior of the mosquitoes in relation to the natural and built environment, and characterized their habitual movements in space, including their usual travel distances, and thus the scale of interventions that might be needed to intercept them. Next slide, please. This plan acts as a record of the survey of 119 houses and puts forth a spatial argument that houses closest to the marsh were affected first, that symptoms of fever were most severe in locations closest to the marshes, and that the nearer a house is to the marsh, the earlier its inhabitants become sick. The study led to the drainage of the Clairfond marshes and the destruction of this ecosystem. Understanding mosquito habitat preferences revealed itself to be a tricky target. Some mosquitoes seemed to prefer shaded wooded areas, while others quite stubbornly persecuted the inmates of houses, as Dr. Ross put it. Next slide, please. Some empirical research also showed that mosquitoes favor water covered in algae, which necessitates sunlight to grow. This led the Director of Forests to recommend the reforestation of so-called river reserves, 10 to 50 feet wide belts along watercourses where the government could regulate vegetational cover even when located on private property. Many of these rivers were located on sugarcane estates, the expansion of which caused extensive deforestation. Although the relation was not understood at the time, the first outbreak of malaria coincided with the establishment of a sugarcane monoculture on the island. This major shift in land use created the environmental conditions that allowed malaria to spread. Next slide, please. Mosquito behavior remained confounding until entomologist Malcolm McGregor made a major discovery. Multiple mosquito species were spreading malaria. This led to intense research in the 1920s and 30s into the habits and habitats of Anopheles funestus and Anopheles gambiae. Extensive surveys of breeding sites were produced as part of an island-wide project of larviciding. Next slide, please. For instance, a minute analysis of the temperatures, salinity levels, and water flow through these abandoned salt pans led to their rehabilitation through small interventions in the form of stonework, the opening of channels to the sea, the addition of sand, and promoting the growth of different grass species. Next slide. At a different scale, a survey of the eastern region named Flak recorded some 30,000 patches of water on 15-meter intervals, each location numbered and physically recorded. Next slide. The painstaking efforts put into larviciding meant that by 1948, the capital and center of business, Port Louis, as well as the residential Central Plateau, were close to being malaria-free. However, malaria was still a threat in the coastal plains. Many inhabitants had moved to the towns of Vacoas and Quatre-Bonnes on the high plateau. As a result, less fortunate Indo-Mauritians, originally brought to the island as indentured laborers, had thus acquired property in the less desirable lowlands. This differentiation of wealth, class, and ethnicity was further intensified by the climatic McGregor line, an altitudinal line at approximately 1,000 feet above sea level, separating the hot coastal areas from the cool central plateau. The line was directly implemented through the spraying of insecticide. Indeed, launched in 1948, the malaria control scheme sent a large nationwide team to conduct indoor spraying for the following 3 years on a seasonal basis. The map on the left shows the unsprayed central zone, referring to the wealthier area within the cooler climatic zone. Even in the spray zones, houses with painted walls, a sign of wealth, would receive special treatment. In order to avoid staining of the walls, the usual DDT wettable powder would be replaced with the less destructive DDT solution in kerosene. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, modest homes were subject to repeated insecticide spraying. The traditional construction techniques and local customs irritated the head of the spraying scheme, Dr. Dowling. He writes, "It has long been the custom in Mauritius for the walls and floors of houses in the coastal districts to be replastered with fresh mud and dung mixture during December in preparation for the New Year festivities. This custom is a long-established one, and in spite of the repeated requests by our staff, the population continued to cover up the surface deposit of insecticide with fresh plaster." End of quote. Such practices undermined the work of Dr. Dowling's spraying teams, who also faced the challenge of homes that were locked while entire families worked the fields during the sugarcane harvest. On the whole, though, it was reported that only 3 households were prosecuted for refusal to allow entry during the spraying campaign. By 1952, Anopheles funestus was considered eradicated through spraying, while Anopheles gambiae was being controlled through larviciding. And in the 1960s, malaria efforts switched to surveillance and treatment of imported cases. The last indigenous case of malaria was found in 1965, a remarkable achievement in public health. In conclusion, malaria eradication in Mauritius relied heavily on landscape and territorial strategies, based on environmental surveying and mapping at various scales. Let me reflect on these strategies in relation to the current COVID-19 pandemic. In Mauritius, land use change through the replacement of indigenous forests by sugarcane monoculture altered the island's ecology and produced new favorable habitats for mosquitoes. Today, global land use change, and more specifically the exploitation of fertile soils for agriculture, has led to massive destruction of wildlife habitats. This is one of the causes of the emergence of COVID-19 through cross-species transmission. While non-human species present risks as sources of pathogens, they also hold the key to many potential treatments. This makes the protection of wildlife habitats through careful land use planning imperative. Finally, climatic zoning in Mauritius allowed the authorities to penetrate the domestic space and enforce the application of toxic substances in the home. This radical and intrusive act was successful in nearly completely eradicating malaria. Yet it also solidified the conception of safe and unsafe, desirable and undesirable zones on the island. The case of Mauritius should alert us to the potential of exacerbating socioeconomic inequalities through such territorial zoning. Global climate change is likely to accelerate the creation of so-called desirable zones with rapid and mass migrations of population. We've already observed vast migrations of the working poor in India. In the Western Hemisphere, we've seen the wealthy abandon the city for their secluded second homes. Such movements of population, especially if they become permanent, may call for the renegotiation of the socioeconomic contract between global cities and hinterlands, a proposition that is laden with potentially conflictual but also beneficial prospects. Thank you for your attention.